Thank you, everybody, for coming out today to the Freedom Schools program sponsored by the Mellon Foundation and Association for Study and Life of African American History. My name is Dwayne Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Mount Zion Memorial Fund, and I wanted to thank you, everybody, for coming out today. I'm going to turn it over now to your host, Shannon Evans, who is in Columbus at Genesis Church and can introduce our lecturer for today, Dr. Jodi Skipper. Shannon?
Thank you. Dr. Jodi Skipper, I'm so glad she's here today. She drove down from Oxford. She's a professor of anthropology and Southern Studies in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. Hey, that's my alma mater. Go Ole Miss. Dr. Skipper's research interests include African diaspora anthropology, historic sites management, historical archaeology, museum and heritage studies, and Southern studies. She more specifically explores how African American pasts are represented in the present. She is an applied anthropologist who explores the representation of African American lives through material culture. Her theoretical approach draws on contextual emphasis in public history, public archaeology, and cultural representations in museum studies. She established a foundation for intersecting these fields through her dissertation work on the St. Paul United Methodist Church, a historically African American church in the Dallas, Texas Arts District. Dr. Skipper examined the church community's prospects of preserving its historic building and historical legacy through two heritage projects, one in which archaeologists excavated a shotgun house site on the church property, and a public history project in which she created an interpretive history exhibition on the church. I could go on and on about Dr. Skipper, but the most important thing to me is that she is such a gem and a jewel to our community and Mississippi's continued studies in African American history and culture, and we are honored to bring her here today. Dr. Skipper, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Intro, Shannon, and thanks everyone for being here. I hope that everyone can hear me okay, but if there are some issues, then please let me know. I'll go on ahead and get started. I'll just briefly say, per the topic of today, I will give a very general intro to the transatlantic slave trade and then talk some about a few of the African survivals that we as anthropologists think through. There are many, and there's many nuance to a lot of this, especially the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm going to try to make it as comprehensive as I can, but certainly if there are any questions, just please let me know. Okay, can everyone see the slideshow? Okay, good. Okay, so I'll begin with thinking about why the transatlantic slave trade is exceptional. And one reason that we think about that is because, as many of us know, slavery was not a new institution at the start of the transatlantic slave trade. It's something that's happened for millennia, but there are certain characteristics that are evident in different aspects of different slave trades. So I just want to make sure that we're clear in many ways about the significance of what we specifically think about as the transatlantic slave trade. So one, we're talking about a high volume of people in a relatively short period of time. We're also talking about an overwhelming majority of Africans being transported during the slave trade in the 18th and then in the 19th century. And then we're looking at, again, estimates of maybe 6.5 million Africans being shipped out during that period of just over 100 years, as I have here, 17 to 1810. But those statistics vary, and as we study more, certainly we come to know more. There are many questions about why captives from the African continent to the Americas. Of course, when we think about this idea of exploitative labor or needing cheap labor or freed labor in the Western Hemisphere, it's not that there are other populations that weren't tried. Of course, we have Native indigenous groups, But we also have various times of when we think about at least colonial history and later, that we have folks who are being brought over from Europe, at least some attempts to have them be a labor force. But what we're going to focus on more is why the labor force from Africa seemed to work for so many European colonies and what the motive and strategy might have been behind that. So we think about kind of root causes. One is what historians refer to as the Great Dying. And this speaks to a particular period where you have indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere initially meeting up with Spanish conquerors and eventually colonizers who meet with these new populations. And then over time, you have the introduction of new diseases that a lot of people who are in the Western Hemisphere are not immune to. There's a pretty significant rate of death in a relatively short period of time. That's going to leave open a gap in the labor force that the Spanish had already exploited in particular parts of the Americas for quite a while. Another reason is that European populations were already familiar with African enslaved labor. So especially if we think about the Portuguese who got a lot of this started in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, they had already practiced slaveries beginning with these early plantation complexes in places like Madeira, which are off of the west coast of Lisbon, but then also looking at the West Central African coast in places like Sao Tome and Principe. So they had some practice, not necessarily on the interior of the continent, but certainly places connected to the continent are also outside of it, closer to Portugal. And then there's the relative cost effectiveness, and I'll show a map in a bit that'll help to explain that a bit more. So I mentioned this Great Dying before and what it leads to, especially for a lot of these indigenous communities on the Western Hemisphere. As I have here is this massive social, economic, and cultural upheaval. When we look at even what's now the southern United States, there are estimates that in this period that you might have had a population of Native people at around 2 million or so at its height, and then that dwindles down to about 200,000. So when we look at that, even on a micro scale, and we think about other places in the Americas where you might have had similar impact, that could give you a sense of how small some of these populations would have gotten, and then have to regroup and form other chiefdoms or other groups as some type of a collective as a result of that. And then, as I mentioned before, it also set in this motion of forced migration, again, of millions of African men and women, and of course, that includes children across the Atlantic. The cost effectiveness, and again, it might be hard for us to just think about geographically, but if we look here at the most eastern border of South America, and thinking more specifically about Brazil, when we look at that proximity to the Senegambian region in West Africa, you see how relatively short that is. And for comparison, you can see here that it's relatively shorter than getting from the west coast of the African continent to the east coast of the African continent. That trip in itself is pretty cost effective. So what this ultimately constitutes is this Middle Passage that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And this, in a general sense, is used to describe the ocean voyages that enslaved people endured from Africa to the Americas. And it refers to that middle part of a newly enslaved person's journey between capture in Africa and also sale to slaveholder in the Americas. And of course, when I say Americas, that means the Americas broadly, parts of North America, what's now Central America and South America as well. And there were many points of departure on the West African continent. Of course, for the sake of time, I can't speak to all of them, but I'll just give one example that we might be more familiar with, and that's Gorée Island, Senegal, which from the 15th to the 19th century was the largest slave trading center on the African coast. And it was ruled by a variety of European powers, but including the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and the French over time. And so if you were to visit Goree Island today, and many people do, many people take tours of these sites in West Africa. You can visit, for example, the dungeons that enslaved people were held in, but you could also see that this was a very active town in many ways. There were people living here full time, leading lives, building families while managing the slave trade in many ways. So we often imagine that you bring in enslaved people and there's not much else going on. But there are literally people who are living their lives as managers in this market. And what I found interesting when I visited is that you could literally see the shapes of shifts in the construction of these buildings, which really indicates how much weight this particular industry carries. And this gives you a little bit of a closer look at some of the slave dungeons, or what I'm sure that several of you have been here, but if you haven't, of course, there would have been no lighting that's contemporary so that visitors could get through, or for the accessibility of visitors. But what you're generally looking at is European slave traders placing captives in shackles, and then they keep them in these cramped, unsanitary prisons alongside strangers who are enduring similar emotional and physical trauma. And they were given the bare minimum of food. A lot of this was just enough to keep them alive while preserving their economic value. So that's the kind of balance these slave traders are working with here. Obviously, these conditions would be horrific, averaging 2 months in duration. There are some estimates that about 12.5 million Africans were captured and enslaved by Atlantic slave traders between this broader period. So the statistics I gave before were between 1700 and 1810. But here we're thinking about the longer period between 1500 and 1870. Estimates are about 12.5 million. To some, that's conservative, so it could be higher. And then over 1.5 million people died in their voyage from Africa to the Americas. Again, estimates here. Historians also estimate that between 10 and 20% of enslaved captives who survived the Middle Passage died within their first year in the Americas. So we're talking about some pretty high mortality rates here. So when we look at what's happening on the other side, the American side, if we think about where enslaved or captured Africans are coming from, some are coming from the Windward Coast, modern-day Liberia and the Ivory Coast, what was considered the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and I have some of the percentage breakdowns here. The Bight of Benin, a bight means a bend in a bay, and you could see that in the map. Coastal Togo, Republic of Benin, and southwest Nigeria. The Bight of Biafra, that's a little over 15%, southeast Nigeria and Cameroon, and then West Central Africa, the largest number here, about 39%, and then Southeast Africa as well, about 5% in terms of estimates. I mentioned Portuguese intervention in the slave trade earlier. They tried for many years to be able to move vessels south in order to get around the African continent. Were able to do that successfully. Some of you might have heard of Prince Henry the Navigator. He's not literally the navigator, but the one financing navigation, which is why he's often attributed with this. But they were able to get around the African continent in a relatively short period of time once they were able to develop the vessels with the ability to do that. And the Spanish as well, coming in relatively early into the Americas in this particular case. So the Portuguese earliest into the African continent, but the Spanish coming in relatively early into the Americas. Some of the places that we might be familiar with in terms of early destinations are Hispaniola, when we think about Haiti or what's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Mexico, Peru, and then other Spanish claimed territories. Many of us in the U.S. tend to associate the United States with slavery because so much of what we hear about in popular culture, in narrative, at least from maybe the 1970s to the 1990s or early 2000s or so, really highlights what's going on in the U.S. That's changed a little bit, but it's a big part of narrative, but in terms of numbers, relatively small. So if we think about places like Mexico and Peru combined, for example, more enslaved people would have been taken to those places than what's now the U.S. It's just that slavery lasted a relatively shorter period of time, and people assimilated into those nations differently. And then we have by 1600 Brazil, okay, which becomes heavily dominated by the Portuguese, becoming the world's leading sugar producer. So if we look at based on available data, so between 1662 and 1867, again, that's just after the end of the Civil War in the U.S., nearly 90% of captured Africans would end up in Brazil. In the Caribbean, again, that speaks to the numbers I'm thinking about in terms of relatively less in what's now the U.S. But with Brazil, more than 40% alone, which is why Brazil is considered the second largest Black nation next to Nigeria for this particular reason. The cost effectiveness of transporting that I showed in the map really helped to facilitate that process there. The English and French Caribbean, so we think about places like Barbados and then Martinique on the French side, for example, received about 37%. The Spanish Caribbean, thinking about Cuba, for example, about 10%. And then North America, what becomes the U.S., approximately 4 to 7%. There are different estimates of that. And I do have an image which came out several years ago that I think was really helpful to people to get a sense of what these slave voyages might have looked like in terms of number and what the height would have been of people moving across the Middle Passage in this particular case. So hopefully I can pull this up and you can see it'll go by pretty quickly, but you should be able to see years at the top, and then you'll see the number of slave voyages corresponding to those years. And when you get into the 1700s, you'll start to see a pretty big increase. You also get to see where they're going. So now you can see ships heading from Central Africa to Brazil, also to particular parts of the northern part of South America and the Caribbean, but less to what's now the U.S. And now you start to see a bit of a pickup in numbers. Pretty big increase here.
Oh, there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
What can you tell us about the targeting of different ethnic groups for their skills in engineering?
I'll get to that, but for now, I'll just say in general that folks who captured Africans were really strategic about where they got them from. For example, if you were aiming to bring captured Africans to Charleston, for example, or an eventual point maybe to southern Louisiana, you would think more strategically about those who have some experience in rice production, like from the Senegambia region. So
I think your slides are.
no, I paused it to answer the question. So hopefully they could still hear me, but I didn't want to talk while they're looking at the image. There's a lot of correlation between those things, and I'll get into that in a little bit.
A lot of chattering.
You'll see the banning of the international slave trade in the early 19th century. So then you'll see less folks, for example, going to what's now North America. Those numbers will decrease, but you'll still see a lot in terms of transport from West Central Africa to South America, in particular parts of the Caribbean. So I think this visualization is helpful, and it does certainly match with what we know historically. Okay, should I stop for questions, Shannon?
I think that there's tons of questions. It's a chat. So let me see. Let's see.
Was there supposed to be
Dwayne, someone asked Dwayne, in my visit to South Carolina, I heard about targeting certain West African populations for specific engineering skills, for instance, with rice, draining and designing land. Let's see.
Was there supposed to be an
The
animation?
degree of strategy. There's no other real questions.
Was there supposed to be an animation on the screen?
Yes, they were supposed to be able to see a visual of the voyages with these little black dots. Did folks not get to see that?
No, we're still looking at your slides.
Let me try this again. Okay, I'll back this up. Are you able to
There
see?
we can
Okay,
see.
thanks for letting me know. So here it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you'll start to see, based on what's going on historically, increases, especially when we start to get to the 1700s, and then some decreases, maybe moving to what's now North America at the early 19th century after the international slave trade is banned. So those are the things that I was saying. But you could see that they're relatively smaller numbers, and then you'll see some big increases and where people are coming from and going to where in the Americas. And notice you'll also see some going to Europe as well. You'll also see them going to the Northeast U.S. Of course, we know that we had slavery in the North as well. So you'll see some ships going there on the U.S. side. Quite a bit to what's Haiti and the Dominican Republic in terms of number. Also to Brazil. Even earlier, you might have seen some going to what's now Mexico and other parts of Central America. You still see them going to the Caribbean, for example, but they shouldn't be going to North America at this point after the banning of the international slave trade in the U.S. and then also in England. Okay. I think that someone shared the link, so thanks for doing that. Okay, so of course we're going to have some serious impacts on the American side, but on the continental African side as well. So if we think about impacts on the American side, again, when I use that term, I'm talking about the Americas more broadly. We have the majority of all Africans enslaved in the southern English colonies are coming from West Central Africa. And it's estimated that nearly 70% of all African people transported in the transatlantic slave trade between 1517 and 1700 were from West Central Africa. Between 1701 and 1800, people from West Central Africa comprised about 38% of all Africans brought to the West to be enslaved. And then in South Carolina, by 1730 is when we start to get what constitutes a Black majority by this point. So the number of Africans are saltwater Negroes, mostly from West Central African native-born African Americans, exceeded the white population. So if we think about this in some context, I'm mostly talking about the transatlantic slave trade here, but if we talk about when slavery starts to become legal in the colonies in the U.S. in the early 17th century, so within maybe 100-year period, we're looking at places like South Carolina colony, for example, that have majority Black populations. This happens in a relatively quick period. And here's an advertisement for the sale of captive people held in 1760 in Charleston, South Carolina. And they would have been a particular interest because they hailed from the Windward and Rice Coast, and someone asked about that earlier. So again, they're specifically targeting people who are skilled in rice production. And again, that also includes being able to engineer an irrigation system. This is very complicated and difficult work to be able to do. And then African captives brought to colonial America helped establish, of course, the rice-based economy of South Carolina. And as I get later into the presentation, I'll talk about how that has an impact on the development of Black food culture there. So impacts on the African continent, light of internal wars, again, so similar to the instability that you had in the Americas with indigenous populations, you start to have on the African continent as well, again, in a relatively short period of time, a lot of instability and restructuring on the continent. And I know that you had a couple of great presentations about the development of particular cities in West Africa and some of the major groups responsible for that. But the slave trade does do quite a bit of damage by this point. The introduction of major political upheavals, migrations, also power shifts from greater to lesser centralized authority of Congo and other African societies. And in some ways, it destroyed old lineages and kinships, not completely, of course, but there was quite some destruction, upon which the basis of social order and organization was maintained in African societies. So we think about what survived, or Africans in the Americas. Maybe before I moved on to African survivals, I should check to see if there are any questions, anything that I need to address from folks. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So as I said before, I'm going to talk about a few things. There's no way to measure the impact that Africans have had on the Americas. It's really broad. I'm just going to give some examples here. And the first that I'm going to talk about are Afro-diasporic religions. And it's really important because you've got a variety of beliefs and practice, religious and also more secular on the West Africa, on the African continent more broadly. people with all kinds of belief systems and practices coming together with other people with different belief systems and practices to the Americas and having in many ways to restructure their lives and then in belief systems. And we do see similarities, especially where we see people who end up in colonies where you have particular European groups that are dominated by particular religions. And the one that I'll think about today is Catholicism. I think it's the one that maybe anthropologists think most about. So where you start to get practices like voodoo in places like Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and then also candomblé in places like Brazil, but also voodoo in particular parts of the U.S. It's basically a mixture of these African religious beliefs in general, some with more influence than the others. The Yoruba, for example, but then coming here again and having to really think about how to restructure their religious beliefs, at least in a public sense, in their new environments. So when we think about Cuba again, and when I showed the slave voyages map, you saw quite a number of those ships going there. You've got pretty high enslaved population in Cuba, so high that the U.S. tried to take on the entire nation of Cuba as part of the U.S. because it would gain such a significantly high enslaved population. By doing that, that didn't happen at that moment, as we know historically, but there certainly were attempts. And so you've got significant numbers of Africans being brought to places like Cuba, where you end up with Santeria, which is a mixture of folk Catholicism and Yoruba religion in Cuba. And it probably involved from Lukumi Cabildo, what's considered an urban club, where Afro-Cubans gathered to drink and dance. And then candomblé in Brazil, similarly, a set of beliefs, practices, and cosmology. Cosmology is your worldview, basically how you think about your place in the universe in terms of what you believe. And that was introduced by Yoruba slaves and also free people. Early 19th century Bahia, you had temples of worship with apparent origins in the mid-1700s. And then 3 founding candomblés by women. And they incorporated orishas that I'll talk about just a little bit in a sec that participate in rituals in particular places of worship. And again, there's a lot of nuance to this. I'm being very general for the sake of a broad presentation. But orishas, and then I have, if you were to look at the context in Brazilian, what the spelling would be, but also pronounced orishas, spirits or deities from European African beliefs that became popular in African-based religions in places like Brazil or Cuba. Their religious practices were harshly repressed, especially by colonizers who imposed the practice of Catholicism on enslaved people, and that includes in Haiti as well. So to continue worshiping their orishas, Africans used the saints of the Catholic Church to represent their deities. What they were doing in many ways is masking their beliefs in order for them to survive. And because you have a pantheon of these orishas and also many saints, they used a lot of these Catholic saints to mask their orishas so that enslavers, for example, would not know what was going on. They tried this in a variety of ways. So we maybe just look at an example of the correspondences between Orisha and Catholic symbols. Shango, for example, is sometimes masked with St. Peter or St. Jerome, and sometimes represented as a warrior figure or someone who takes care of power, administration, and justice. And then I think maybe one of the most popular, at least in terms of even contemporary U.S. society, is Oshun, who owns fresh water, rivers, and waterfalls, represents delicacy and motherhood, sometimes masked with Our Lady of Fatima, but this could vary in some cases. And I said popular even in a U.S. context. I think a lot of these conversations came out when Beyonce released her Lemonade album, and she took on the representation of Oshun, of the Orisha Oshun, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like, but I'll give you the description first. And this is by a very renowned sociologist, Dr. Zandria Robinson, who wrote quite a bit on Beyonce in popular culture describing this. And she describes part of what you're going to see, but that diving from the top of a building into herself, the translation finds Beyonce's true self underwater, slumbering, while she outwardly tries to dissemble to bracket the hurt and anxiety of a potentially cheating partner. Again, part of Beyonce's Lemonade album, at least in many ways, insinuates or more overtly that her husband Jay-Z had cheated on her, and she's working through some of that album. But then what follows, according to Robinson, is an emergence from baptismal waters, donning the saffron garb associated with Yoruba Orisha Oshun, whose presence endures in Black Southern religious practice. Beyonce emerges from the water undissembled. As such, she is both joy and rage, bringing forth more water in which the street's children can play, sitting out windows with her bat hot sauce, and relishing a theretofore unrealized freedom to be emotionally human. This is a very elegant description, but as I said before, I'll pull this up and I'll try to make sure that it's going before I share. Okay, let me know if you're actually seeing YouTube. Okay, thank you, Shannon. Okay, I'll stop it here. But you can YouTube this and also get to see more of the full length thing, or even watch the entire album. But I think what Zandria describes here is pretty clear. You didn't get to the full point, but you could also see in terms of embodying the spirit of Oshun, how this, at least in terms of representation, becomes evident here. She's done this several times outside of that. So when we think about this, the impact, of course, is not just in places like Haiti or Brazil or Cuba, but even in the U.S., where you have groups specifically in urban areas like New York City, for example, and other places. And in many cases, there are still practices in African-American populations, although they might not particularly realize they're doing certain things because the historical memory, at least, isn't there, but still a lot of influence. And then something else that anthropologists like to think about are African diasporic foods. One is the peanut, although we think it was first domesticated in South America. It came to the U.S. from Africa and then became an important crop in many southern states. Some of you might associate the peanut with George Washington Carver promoting the peanut and then also having hundreds of uses for it. But again, this is one among several. And then also one of my favorites, rice, which in the context of the African continent is enjoyed, in some parts of the African continent, I should be more specific, is enjoyed as the basis of meals or as porridges and sides. Again, this cultivation was practiced is in the Senegambian region and then the Bight of Benin, as I mentioned before. Folks who were enslaved in those areas were strategically taken to some of these rice-producing colonies and then subsequently states for these reasons. For example, it was one of the reasons that enslaved people were brought to Louisiana, where I'm from. Introductions of rice seeds from African slave labor assured that the only reliable food crop that could be grown in the swamplands in and around New Orleans. There were attempts at producing a variety of things, but it took a while for slavery to take root in the Louisiana territory and then more specific in places like New Orleans until they were able to find a successful crops like rice and sugarcane. And then it's used in the preparation of, I'll let folks in the chat tell us what this is, or even in the audience. That's actually a good guess because it looks like fried rice. But maybe can we think of maybe something folks in Louisiana or New Orleans eat?
Gumbo.
Oh, you're giving my next answer. But this one, can we think of something else? Not shrimp etouffee, but that's another good guess, and I'm getting hungry. Jambalaya, thank you. I knew that one. Yeah, using the preparation of jambalaya.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people also cite that there might be some connection to Spanish paella because there's a Spanish influence in places like New Orleans as well. But there are a lot of similarities to African jollof rice. I won't get into debates of the origins of that because that could become very contentious, but there are obviously some similarities. And then one that my friend in the audience already guessed is gumbo. Also one of my favorites. This is gumbo season now. But Louisiana's Creole dishes, for those who are familiar, often start with this base called the Holy Trinity, celery, onions, and it says red bell peppers here, but green bell peppers. I think is mostly the case, but this is what a cookbook gave me as a description. But it tends to be more green bell pepper, so I have to change that. And it's at the heart of this popular dish, but it's Creole because it's a mixture of different cultures coming to create something new. For example, you have, maybe I'll let you all guess. So the roux of the gumbo is coming from which group of people in Europe? Can anyone guess?
France?
France. Someone got it. Yeah, France. Thank you. And then let's see, gumbo also has sausage sometimes. What influence might that be? Folks who also settled the South Louisiana coast. I'll take that.
Can we maybe think about it in more of a, maybe people might
How
be
about
some
German?
rare case?
Someone just said German.
Yeah.
Said German. Thank you.
It's Bev.
I hear your voice. Thank you. Yes, there's also sassafras, which is a spice used to season gumbo. So that would have been the group of people who actually migrated to Louisiana first. They would have been the first people in Louisiana, the first people in the United States, the first people in the Americas, like who are here first?
The
Like
native.
we think about thank you, Native Americans. Absolutely. Local Native American populations and that's actually, if you buy it, then you're going to buy it in the form of gumbo filet, but that's what that is. And then the seafood is local and accessible. And then so are the rice in these particular cases. I might have missed something, but the big thing that we're thinking about here is the African contribution, and that's what. You're not supposed to have gumbo without it. Essentially, gumbo is not a dish if you don't have
Okra.
It's okra. Thank you. And it's an African word taken from the Central Bantu dialect. And you could see in this map here, the Bantu had a more eastern and southern migration to get to this location that you see here in the map. But these are obviously lots of different people, but who have similarities in terms of genealogies of language. There are folks who've done quite a bit of research. One was a woman named Dr. Faintola Mosadami, who did quite a bit of research in Louisiana language to help think about some of these things. What we come up with is that it's a relation to the Umbun Ochigombo okra, an okra plant with its name borrowed from its native Angol, Kingumbo in the South African Bantu dialect, but native to Africa and was probably cultivated in Ethiopia or West Africa. There are folks who do a lot of work to figure this out. But what okra is essentially the thickener for your gumbo. What's happened is that folks have taken the okra out of the gumbo, but African Americans in Louisiana still cook stewed okra separately, which is the gumbo. They don't call it that, but they just call it okra. And then Cajuns in Louisiana are people who came from the Acadia region in Canada down to it's now Louisiana. They'll make it with the roux and then water, but not necessarily with okra. And that's what folks tend to get if you go to New Orleans and eat. But essentially okra and gumbo. If you go to Senegal, for example, and on a menu, you'll see Gombo, and they'll give you essentially the same thing. So it tastes just like the gumbo that my mom makes at home. The food memory is strong here. And actually, this is a picture and the spelling. I took an image the food memory is really strong, that it essentially tastes the same. And then also language, something that we might not think about as much, but certainly still has quite a lot of impact, especially when anthropologists think about African American English, or what's sometimes called Black English vernacular. So basically how people who or a Black American with roots in the South, no matter where you move to around the country in terms of Great Migration or other points of migration, but that you likely speak or have ancestors who spoke some type of African American English or Black English vernacular. If, for example, in Louisiana, that we have African languages that are mixed with French, so then we'll get a Louisiana Creole. In Haiti, you get Creole. So it's not just English, for example, but where you have places that were more colonized by people of white English descent. So you'll get like Gullah Geechee languages, for example. So you get these African languages that are mixed with English. But there are a lot of debates about the origins, and there are probably many, but there's some clear connections to places in West Africa that I'll talk about. So it's one of the most extensively studied and discussed varieties of American English. Pronunciation, syntactic structures, and vocabularies associated with a fairly large number of American African Americans. It tends to be spoken rather than written. And of course, it's no more uniform than the English spoken by any other Americans. There's no real such thing as standard English. We've all kind of adapted English in our own ways. And it's also a complex linguistic system with its own rules. And this is how we come to understand some of what I'll talk about a bit. Some of the possible West African origins are people who are thinking that in many cases when people were enslaved, in order to minimize the potential for riots, they would try to separate people who spoke similar languages in order to minimize organized uprisings, as I have here. So that means that even on this at least 2-month journey on a slave ship, that in order for people to communicate with each other, they would have to develop this rudimentary language that's not, I shouldn't call it language. More specifically, it's called a pidgin. So it's not the native language of any speaker, but it's what happens when two people who don't speak the same language come into contact, but need to be able to communicate. We even think about people who are coming over to the U.S. in the colonial period from Europe with particular native groups. If you're going to trade, then there has to be some kind of trade language. So that's what a pidgin is. So there's some theories that the West African origins of African American English would have likely developed even before ships left the African coast. And again, trying to minimize the ability of organized uprisings on the parts of enslavers. That means that in order for people to communicate, they've got to come up with something else in that time period. In general, West African language often lack the TH sounds and final consonant clusters. So if we think about the word past, in African American English, you might get pass, for example. So that's a similarity. Replacing or simplifying these occurs in both African American English and in West African English varieties spoken in Nigeria and Ghana. There's also a distinction made between completed action, so saying he done walked, and habitual action, saying we be walking in African American English, and that reflects prevalence in West African language systems as well, so something that we might have gotten from them. And this is something that I ask my students about a lot. What's the difference between somebody saying he walking and he be walking? Those are two different things. If somebody be walking, then that means that they might have been doing it for the past few weeks. If he's walking, then he's walking now. So we have various ways of distinguishing that and understanding those things. And again, a lot of those might be rooted in our West African origins related to their language systems. And then what I more specifically study, but I'll spend less time on, but just to give you an introduction, is that we can see this in artifacts, also underground. There was a very well-known archaeologist, Leland Ferguson, who was studying something called colonelware or colonialware in what's now the United States, and it's a low-fired ceramic. So if we think about ceramics, those that are considered more prestigious, like China, are really high-fired. The ones that kind of people might be making on their own and firing themselves might be more low-fired, and this is an example here. But you see basically African Americans and Native Americans trying to reproduce European ceramics, but in their own ways, and you get this thing called colonialware. And often they would mark the bases of these vessels, like this plate in the upper right corner with what some archaeologists think might represent an African cosmogram. For example, if we think about African cosmologies in places like the Congo, where there's a separation of the spiritual world and the physical world, but also an idea of the center being the place where folks need to be closest to, again, how they understand the community's world. There's guesses that this might be some representation of that. Again, we don't have those folks here to tell us, but it's a possibility. Also, this idea of placing vessels with water at grave sites to help people move, literally water as movement, have them move to the other side or literally move back home to the African continent. I think that still happens in many places. I remember when I went to visit my paternal grandmother's grave a few years ago, someone had taken a picture and a little ribbon and attached it to her grave. So I think they were trying to help her spirit move on to the next level through that. And that's something that we do get as an Africanist practice. There are others, but I'll stop there. Okay, can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
That was great. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
And I don't have the question real clear, but I feel, and this may not be your area that you've studied, but I feel like we've learned a fair amount about what happened on the Africa side in terms of the kidnapping of Africans and then the boat and the passage. I just don't feel like I have a great understanding of the business model, economic model on the American side. And I'll just tell you two things that happened. And I wrote it in the chat. Just the calculations that were made in South Carolina about engineering for irrigation. It made me understand that it wasn't just individual plantation people and slave markets. There was something bigger going on in terms of the business of slavery in the United States. And I just don't have a sense of it. The other thing that I saw that also surprised me or whatever is I went to the African American Museum in DC, and one of the things that just absolutely struck me was this small picture of a group of Rhode Island slave merchants. They were in Africa, but they were all like in some kind of very comfortable room having a drink. And just again, that there was this whole group of merchants, and that was this whole economic model that was beyond. And I think we're just taught so much about the plantations and the slave market and not that big infrastructure, and that people were thinking so strategically and calculating, and it was like sort of capitalism at its most evil to me. But I don't know if you can recommend anything or have any other knowledge of that, but I don't feel like that's been taught very much. It's like kind of the infrastructure on the U.S. side. And then you hear about insurance companies and Wall Street, and all of a sudden you get that there's this whole bigger thing. But is it connected somehow? Is there like a Fortune 50 of this terrible enterprise? So that's my question-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, he could probably quickly Google some things and put in the chat that'll help, because there are a lot more historians doing work on that. But you're right. I mean, there are a lot of hands in this pot, and we tend to generalize very specific rural plantations in the U.S. South. I worked in urban context in the U.S. South. So that means that if you're in a city like Memphis or even like Columbus, there's slavery in the city. And then they're dependent on these rural plantations. And then the urban area will help to move the cotton and other things to market. But these big houses in Columbus often had there are people servicing those people in those houses right next to them. So slavery is it's everywhere. And these southern states are still going to be dependent on other southern states for particular products. So if you're operating a plantation and you're not really growing for subsistence, that means you've got to get your other products other places, and you're dependent on them, right, in transport. And then we also know that relatively later, even with cotton production, the North is dependent on the South. There are all these what historians call states of dependency. So the cotton's coming in, they're refining it and then shipping it off to Europe. So Europe's got its hands in the pot as well. But then even outside of that, you're talking about these Rhode Island merchants. These men in places like Rhode Island were some of the wealthiest in the world of the shipbuilding industry in slavery. And it's because there's slavery in the North, but in many ways it's not the large scale plantation slavery that we come to see later in the South, but it's still no small matter. And it just looks a lot of different ways in places like would become New York and things like that. But even in Rhode Island, I think maybe in the 90s there, and we actually have Beverly Bevel who works with this group called Coming to the Table. But actually there was a woman named Katrina Brown whose ancestor was one of those wealthy enslavers in Rhode Island. And she started doing family history and then started trying to do some racial reconciliation around that. So that's something that's just happened maybe in the past, I guess I would say 20 years at this point. But yes, there are all kinds of folks dependent on each other.
I read the book. I think it's called The Half Has Never Been Told, or The
Mhm.
Half, that just really shines a light on the North. Farming,
That's right.
all the things, cotton, obviously, but all the things that were needed and all the people that got wealthy from this economy. And just was it like we'd hear the industrial age or whatever? It almost feels like, how was this envisioned at such a large scale, and people cashing in and seeing like an opportunity here? And I just don't think that's part of history enough. Yeah.
I think that's the thing. Even when we weren't the United States and you had colonies, they were all creating separate laws around slavery. So there was strategizing at particular levels, but not maybe in the more holistic way that you're talking about. It's just that people came to depend on it economically and in many ways had no qualms about enslaving other people to make the money or benefiting from that. And in order to do that, you really have to convince yourself that those people just really aren't human.
Yes.
But thanks for the comment.
Hi. Hi, my name's Tim. I'm in India. I forgot what I was going to say there. Actually, oh yeah, on that point, sorry, my brain's just gone blank. Sorry about that.
That's okay. If it comes up again, then just let me know.
A little bit.
Can I ask another thing? Is Jamaica the same as Cuba or Hispaniola in terms of receiving the same numbers of Africans?
Jamaica starts to receive, when you started to have like imports wane in particular places, then they might pick up in others. And this is what happens in many ways to Jamaica. But there's a lot of nuance to all of this, because if we even think about Haiti and the Dominican Republic, for example, the way that the different parts of the island handle slavery caused them to develop differently. And then Haiti comes to have a lot of enslaved people similar to Cuba. Jamaica does under British colonization as well, but they're not often looking the same. It just depends on the moment. So there's a lot of change over time. And in the context of the Caribbean, there are particular places that maybe perceived as more notorious, like Barbados, for example, where some of these places in the Caribbean knew that they could get enslaved people at particular points so easily that you would just work them to death when they got there and then replace them with new people. So all of your ability to get more people in is really going to determine how you treat them. And then if we're talking about the Dominican Republic, for example, there's more of a cowboy culture with slavery that develops differently. In particular parts of Mexico, enslaved people are diving for pearls, for example. So just look, all kinds of ways. But there's less stability with the slave trade in some of these places. Yeah, I know that I'm missing a lot of nuance, but it's just,
There's a
it's
lot in
very
there.
different in terms of change over time.
I can't remember what I was going to say, but that's another point. I actually live near Bristol, actually, which obviously has huge connections with the slave trade.
Mhm.
But in particular, I live near a place called Durham Park, which was owned by William Blaithwaite. Do you know about Blaithwaite?
The name's familiar, but can you jog my memory a little bit?
He was responsible under Charles II and James I for basically collecting taxes for the crown. And he was responsible for the Caribbean and, in its early days, the Virginia and the Virginia planters. And he's quite an interesting character. He rarely left England, actually. So although he knew Europe, he knew the planters, but he wasn't actually in America. However, it's interesting that he moved from the Caribbean as a responsibility to Virginia, actually, as the sugar was dropping in price in the Caribbean. And I have a personal theory that he suggested to the Virginia planters that they should actually import slaves from the Caribbean because they could get slaves easier and cheaper from the Caribbean than importing them from America.
And they did.
He did, yeah. Yeah. Where I live, I'm also surrounded by that kind of history, actually. It's interesting. Okay.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
And wasn't there something, what's the country that just, is it Barbados? No, there's a country that, it was France. It was Haiti, I guess. But
Yeah.
they gave reparations to the owners.
Yeah, Haiti essentially had to give reparations to France for its losses. And it's a root cause of perpetual debt for the country for a long time. Perpetual debt, excuse me, in the country for a long time.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm here, folks. I've been fooling with this for 5 minutes. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. The middle passage was a horrific insult to virtually an entire race in the United States. And my question is, how did that reverberate through the generations? Were there stories passed down? Is there a cultural implication? How is that felt today by African Americans?
That's a big question, and I'm only one African American, so I'm going to make maybe some guesses here in some ways. I think there's certainly long-term economic impacts on African Americans, and it's the slave trade is the root cause, but the fact that the U.S. continued to fail to grant African Americans full citizenship economically is certainly had a broad impact. I think there are geneticists who think about how many of us might have literally inherited trauma genetically, which we know that your environment can have a lot of impact on your body and could be inherited in that way. So that's maybe more of a literal way to think about it. And African Americans responded a variety of ways. There are people who more explicitly talk to their children and grandchildren, and others who were silent because it was too traumatic. My grandmother was born in the 1920s, not as an enslaved person, but was so traumatized by her relationships to white people, even as a child, that she wouldn't talk about it on audio because she thought that there might be some negative consequences to that. So I think that's for me, that's just 2 generations ago. So I would imagine that folks who sharecropped even longer than that might still have some extensions, some longer legs in terms of impact. So in general, some are tangible, but I think there are others that we might be reproducing, but not necessarily recognize.
Thank you.
Jodi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I think I just want to add to that question. Yeah, I was reading about Clotilda. I don't know if anyone have heard about the last slave ship. Yeah, that was recently discovered. And this prompted an interview with the African town about the effect of the slave trade, presidents, And like you said, I think most times it has to do more with the emotional effect, how people do feel. Most times, how do the present generation feel about it? And I think the people who were actually involved in the slave trade, the buyers of the slaves, one of their descendants was, I think, interviewed. He acknowledged this, but the other ones were like, no, we don't want to talk about this. We don't want. So I think, and on the other hand, the descendants of the slaves themselves were willing to talk about this. They wanted to discuss it. It was emotional for them. They told the story to their generations, to the present generation. They wanted to discuss it, but the other party did not want to discuss it. So for them, it was emotional. When the guy from the other part was willing to apologize and say, okay, we are sorry. I know that this is not my fault. This is for my forefathers, for my generation. And it was quite emotional. So I think the effects most times is basically intangible, not mostly tangible, especially in contemporary time. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thanks for that. And also thanks for bringing up Africa Town in Alabama. There's been quite a bit of attention to it more recently, but something that historians have known for a while. In general, there were some pretty prestigious white men in Alabama who, on a bet, decided to import Africans after it was illegal to do. So what you have in African Town are people who are enslaved who remember being in West Africa in the early 20th century. You've got folks who are first generation Africans in Alabama relatively late because they came in after the slave trade was already illegal. They weren't the only, but it's what we consider the last slave ship. And there were a lot of them, and the name's the Clotilda's. I'm sure I didn't get her name, but as she said. And so you're talking about people whose grandparents were enslaved, and people who were in the contemporary period who had grandparents who were enslaved or great-grandparents who were enslaved, who they remember, which is pretty remarkable to think about. And Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist, did quite a bit of research. There's actually some documentary film as a result of her. So there are people who knew this and worked on it, but it's taken up until recently for it to get maybe widespread and attention. And a lot of that has to do with the descendants of the folks who were responsible and whether or not there would be some accountability for them. And that's often why people don't talk about these things, because especially people who are descendants of enslavers, some do. For the majority who might not, I think there are concerns about consequences or reparations or something of that sort.
Jodi,
I bet.
I'm just really enthralled about this conversation because there was a question earlier about the economic part of slavery, and you just hit it. Where people who were part of being slaveholders may or may not want to even acknowledge that part of it. But you talk about insurance company industries in terms of insuring slaves, whether for labor, and just doing some of the research on my own ancestry, where 10-year-old ancestor or enslaved ancestor was rented out and for the year and brought in $350, which is equivalent to about $20,000 in today's market. And so I think as a country, it's hard enough that it's just enslaving other human beings, but there is a business side that would, I don't want to say support, but would be an encouragement for people to enslave other people, making millions of dollars. And usually the slave labor was worth more than the plantation itself.
Yeah. From a British,
Absolutely. So if you lost your enslaved people, you went into debt, which would have essentially been the case with Thomas Jefferson, for example.
Exactly.
from a British perspective, that's still a massive problem in my own culture, huge, because of course it was all about money. There was no other reason for transporting slaves except money. So actually, when they had the opportunity to produce enough sugar to make money, they wanted to produce more to make more money. And the only way to do it was to slave Africans, as they saw it. Actually, it was the cheapest way to do it. But in Britain, that's a huge continual talking subject. Whether about the records that they unearthed a few years ago of the slave compensation payments. You know that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Can you repeat that? I'm not sure that I heard.
A few years ago, they found the records. Actually, the University College London found records of compensation paid to slave owners. And actually, it was one of the conditions of ending slavery outside of the UK. And what they discovered was that actually the amount of money that the British government actually had to borrow from banks to pay the slave owners to end slavery, again, because of their value, actually was only paid back to the banks in the 1970s. So this is, like you said, this is really recent history. And it's a massive bone of contention in the UK because many of our wealthiest families, their wealth has come down from enslaving Africans, and they still have that wealth. And there's obviously quite a lot of argument about whether they should be allowed to keep it or not.
Absolutely. Any others? I don't want to forget about the audience either. So you all have any questions, and certainly let me know.
I just was going to say, we wonder why teaching this true history is so contentious in our school districts. The truth.
Yeah, here too. But there is actually a whole movement here of radical historians who reject what they consider to be a revisionist history because they just can't stomach the idea of seeing colonialism for what it was, really. And they're in complete denial of the reality of it.
The post-times to an African culture today that's still recognized and stuff like this, y'all have Creole people that still have post-times. Is there other state in the United States that before my culture like that, like these aliens, but that French core is yes, there that stuff.
Yeah. I can repeat his question. That's a good question. So thinking about contemporary African survivals in U.S. communities, and there are folks who might be able to answer that in a variety of ways. But I think that maybe the one that gets the most attention is the Gullah Geechee community in South Carolina. So in the Charleston area and then the Sea Islands in coastal Georgia and North Florida. So all of these enslaved people who lived off the coast. What happened in those cases is that if you're enslaved, and have you been to Charleston? So if you kind of look at a map, so the city of Charleston is near the coast, but it's not an island. And then you have all of these little islands outside of Charleston where they enslaved people. Like they grew rice on these little islands. These folks had no connection to the mainland until the 1970s. So that means that you didn't have a bridge connecting you to the city of Charleston and the rest of the state of South Carolina until then. So what happens is, because you're largely talking to people who speak like you sound the same for a longer period of time. So culturally, they have, like people who speak Creole in Louisiana, they have their own way of speaking that's very distinct because they were able to speak to each other over time for so long. And I don't want to mimic it to say what it sounds like because I'm not from there, but maybe it's similar to Louisiana Creole in some ways. So let's see. So I might say, like, if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't understand Louisiana Creole, I'll say, I'm going to the store. But if I'm talking to my mom or my grandma, I might say, "Ma'am, I'm going to the store, yeah." So it sounds very different. And a lot of, again, like I said, the language structure is African in its essence in many ways. Some of it French, but a lot of it African. So they tend to be seen. It's not that you don't have African influences in other parts of the United States, but you asked about those. So that's probably one of the most distinct. Yeah.
So
That's right. That's right. And it is a Creole that they speak. So it's like a mixture of English and West African languages, but they're referred to as Gullah Geechee populations. That's what they're called. And they've done a lot of work to preserve their heritage. But what you see a lot of in the news more recently is that a lot of their land has been unfortunately taken away to build the tourism industry in Charleston and outside of it. So you still see like contemporary efforts to like take land in heinous ways from people who've had it in their families for extended periods of time. But a lot of it has to do with the level of isolation for them, that you're on an island and not having much contact with the mainland until they build bridges so that they were able to do it. But great question. Any others, questions, thoughts? I know we seem to have a lot of experts in the audience, which is great.
Can I ask, actually, you were sitting there in Mississippi, obviously, and I used to have a business in Mississippi. It's where my interestedness started. But I wonder how you see the problems of misrepresentation and cultural appropriation by the kind of blues tourist industry that's developed in Mississippi.
Yeah, it's a great question, but still a big question. Maybe can you give me something a little more specific?
Okay. Let's think about that.
It could be another question about economics. Who is making money off blues tourism?
Okay, so that's I'll take that.
That's a good.
So maybe I'll address that one then. Thank you, Marcia. What's happened, especially in the state of Mississippi in kind of the late, maybe around 2000, 2010 or so, is that you started to get the state really focus on economically supporting blues tourism. And the state didn't actually start it on its own. It was a response to people coming from places like Europe who had been fans of the Rolling Stones and other groups who were influenced by blues musicians in the Delta and wanted to see the places where a lot of them came from. So they started coming on their own. And then the state subsequently built an industry around that and started to support it. So you started to get blues markers, a blues marker trail, blues festivals, a lot of things coming out of that to bring more tourists in a concerted way. And what's happened is that there are some local folks, but also quite a number of folks who might be from the outside other states who've come in and developed tourism businesses and have made disproportionately more money as a result of that. I don't want to give the impression that people are really becoming wealthy off of it either, because it's not as sustainable in the state as it could be, because there really isn't the infrastructure to bring people in and keep them in. So they might come in, do a few things, go to a festival or two, but then they're not necessarily long-term in many ways. One of the biggest critiques is that the money doesn't trickle down to majority Black communities in the Delta, which has been the case. And my guess is that, again, blues tourism isn't my focus. I think more about slavery tourism, but my guess is that when people advocate for tourism events, they're probably making cases to the city that it's going to bring money to the city, but that when in some ways it might help with some support, I just don't think that it's trickling down to the folks who are actual descendants of the blues artists. Although it's fair to say that there are blues artists today, several of them are Black, who are making at least a partial living from that industry.
I think also it's important. Actually, I had a business to do with blues in 1996. I think I started it with American. And actually, we wanted to build a business which actually benefited African Americans because we love that culture and love that music. And since then, my major worry is exactly what you just enunciated. Has it actually had any effect on the African American community? And I know it has had some effect. For instance, friends of mine that are musicians can work, but certainly they don't seem to have been people that have made the most money out of that. And more white people, often largely from the north, actually seem to have actually created the businesses and the money. But as you say, it's like you're not talking about huge businesses or huge amounts of money.
No, I don't think that's the case. And again, this is not my specific focus. Some of this is anecdotal for me, but also I think that a lot of what's happened is that the blues industry was built on a very particular type of blues at a very particular moment. What Black folks tend to listen to is Southern soul, which is rooted in the blues, but it's not the same thing. And that's not what's being promoted as part of the blues industry. And I think that maybe if there was a broader expansion and support for that, that might make a difference. I just don't think that's what's happening.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, you can't keep playing the same music forever. Music actually has to change and grow like everything else.
So I'm curious. My head is spinning and thinking, so why then can't the government who's giving them permission to have the concerts, why can't they just, I don't know, taxation, just have some kind of an allotment that goes into some kind of a community funds that benefits the local merchants or programs for the community?
So I know there's some, like the Delta Blues Museum has a program that targets local students, and there's some who've even become blues musicians out of that. So there's some things, but I don't know, like economically, what the pots of money might look like. I'm just, I guess, making the point that blues is not necessarily the blues that Black folks are going to see. So it's really targeting folks from the outside to come to these places. And also the type of music that you have these Southern soul artists, they're not the ones who are going to be making the money. These blues festivals, they might have one or two of them in a lineup, but
Yeah.
that's how it seems to work.
Yeah. I guess
And there's a lot of money in Southern soul.
there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's quite an odd situation, I think, in that actually it's developed from people wanting to support the blues, but blues that they were listening to 40 or 50 years ago that actually came from 40 or 50 years before that. So it's got into this kind of weird circle, like you say, where it's actually not progressing anywhere, whereas it would perhaps actually be more economic benefit for everybody if it did allow for more progression, actually.
If the state cared for everybody to economically benefit, it's just my personal opinion is that there would have to be economic support of education and infrastructure, even if there was some chance that this blues tourism industry, even as it is, would work. It
Yeah,
just
I've
doesn't
actually
have the support is in some ways superficial, I think.
absolutely. I don't know to what extent Clarksdale College, for instance, runs courses in tourism to promote people to be managers and to create businesses themselves, which would be really helpful.
There's some local people who work really hard all the time at this. I just think that they don't have the supportive structures that they could have. When the Sinners movie came out, there were quite a number of young Black folks from or in Clarksdale who just within a matter of probably days came together with this very cohesive symposium over several days to think about a lot of these things. I just think, again, they're largely grassroots in that sense.
Yeah.
Clark's at Delta State, there's a program in music entrepreneurship that came out of trying to figure out how to help young musicians coming from Cleveland, Clarksdale, the Delta area, how to monetize what they do.
That's good.
Yeah, just thinking the amount of money isn't that much. I have helped blues musician write. I write grants for the MAC, Mississippi Arts. One is due Monday. I think they try, but they're quite small grants for a lot of work to put into it. And so the spirit is there, it seems. And this is traditional blues. But yeah, I just don't think the resources not there. And it's sad because it's just music in Mississippi, I just think really it's a real rich culture from traditional blues all the way to what's happening now. And it's just unfortunate that there's not as many pipelines or channels or some way to uplift it.
Yeah, it comes down to funding, doesn't it, really? As do many things in the end. We all need more funding.
That's right.
Thank you very much. This was great and well researched. I do have one more question. You mentioned Dallas, Texas, and I was curious what the connection was. Did I hear St. Paul's? Is that a Dallas? And so what is your connection to Dallas?
Yes, I did a dissertation project on St. Paul United Methodist Church, it's in a historic Freedmen's community in Dallas, but now in the Dallas Arts District. And it's one of the only Black institutions that actually stayed in the Freedmen's community when many were forcibly removed or moved through eminent domain or other means. And I had a colleague who did an archaeology excavation there, and then the church wanted an exhibit. And that's what I eventually worked on for them. But a lot of what I was thinking about is what does it mean to be like a historically Black institution when your Black community is gone?
I suppose actually slavery tourism is a bit of a contentious subject, really, isn't it? I once photographed a jail in Pace, Mississippi. Do you know Pace? It's right at the bottom of the Delta, tiny place. And I just happened to go there. I just happened to be driving around, and actually a bunch of guys are using convicts from Parkland Farm to renovate a 100-year-old jail, which was basically just corrugated iron and iron. And that was like from before the Jim Crow era. And they were renovating it because the small population of the town thought it would be a good tourist attraction. I'm not sure if anyone ever went there to see it, to be honest.
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of towns in the state at this point are disproportionately dependent on their history is a selling point, and that there's a lot of there are a lot of complications around it. These are all great comments and questions. Any others?
If there are no more questions, I want to thank Dr. Skipper for coming and joining us today and all of our guests. I will take this recording and it will be up in Zoom in about 3 days. By the time I edit it, pull out some shorts and do all the magic one has to do. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And I especially want to thank Dr. Skipper for coming from Ole Miss. If there are no more questions, if Dwayne wants to remind everybody about what's up next, I'll hand it over to Dwayne.
You might want to take your microphone block off, Dwayne.
Guys, yeah. I just put in the chat a historiography of slavery in North America that I compiled over several years of doing my own graduate studies. It's by no means exhaustive, but it does cover the major debates in scholarship from early 1900s through the 2010s. I will also be sending an email out with not only the recorded lecture once Shannon finishes editing it, but I'll also include the historiography in it as well. But thank you so much for not only the spirited questions and answer period, but thank you, Dr. Skipper, for coming today. This was
Thanks,
wonderful.
Dwayne.
Don't forget, we have several other lectures coming up. Dr. Skipper will be delivering her second lecture next week, more focused not on the transatlantic slave trade, but more specifically slavery in Mississippi, particularly more the domestic slave trade after transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808. I'm excited about that lecture as well, especially after today's has gone so wonderfully. Please come back next week. We would love to have another question and answer session like this. It's going to be wonderful. I'm going to be here, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you for the Mellon Foundation and Sala. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Yes. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.